I met my best friend Tim, reconnected with Mike, and ended up dating him. Tim blocked me when I shared my news, still miss him. Hello everyone. I would like to hear your thoughts on this situation. During the summer of 2021, while I was on vacation at my grandmother's house, I met my best friend, whom I will refer to as Tim. I am quite a romantic person, but I felt comfortable with him. I did not have any romantic feelings for him, nor did I wish to pursue a relationship with him. He was simply the best friend I could share various interests with. For 2.5 years, we only communicated during my visits to my grandmother, but over the past year and a half, we began to talk every day when I was in the city with my parents and also engaged through social media during my daily walks. Now, let me tell you a bit about my boyfriend, whom I will call Mike. In 2020, I met a guy online whom I liked very much, but at that time he had a girlfriend, and our communications ceased after just a month. In the winter of 2023, Tim reintroduced me to Mike since they had been spending time together. At that time, Mike was still in a relationship, so we did not interact much during the 2 weeks that I was there, as we essentially ignored each other. After returning to my parents, I continued to talk to Tim every day, and he had been looking forward to my arrival. Mike was not even on my mind. By July 2024, I visited my grandmother's house again and started spending time with Tim every day. He introduced me to Mike once more, and we began hanging out as a group. Towards the end of July, we celebrated Tim's birthday at Mike's house. Before the celebration, Tim messaged me one evening saying that Mike had feelings for me, which I didn't pay much attention to, yet it brought me some happiness. As Tim's birthday approached, we celebrated, but Mike drank excessively and had no recollection of the events that transpired at the party. Tim decided to have a bit of fun with Mike and suggested that I create a scenario where Mike was bothering me, kissing me, and saying inappropriate things, and the key was that Mike needed to believe it. I agreed, though it made me uncomfortable. For some reason, I went along with it. We escalated the situation as much as we could, to the point where Tim jokingly proposed marriage to Mike, intending only to upset him. For some inexplicable reason, I did not intervene, even though I occasionally felt hurt for Mike, and I struggled to comprehend my actions and their motivations. As the end of August approached, I had to leave, and during that time, Tim and I pretended to be a couple to irritate Mike. I did not feel attracted to Tim, we were simply friends. We continued to communicate every day, and I also started speaking with Mike daily, but I could not decipher my feelings for him. I was unsure if I truly liked him. From July 2024 to January 2025, I heard negative remarks from Tim about Mike's behavior, which I observed myself, though it did not bother me significantly. I can still recall Tim's comment about my friendship with Mike. "If you are friends with Mike, then I will apologize to you." I did not grasp his meaning then, as I believed they were friends and questioned why they still interacted. In November 2024, Tim began mentioning a girl whom I will refer to as Lily, and I asked him if he was interested in her, to which he confirmed. In December 2024, while visiting my grandmother, I spent less time with Tim than before. It felt like I had been replaced since his communication with me had changed. I began to respond less frequently and declined to meet him. I had intended to give him a New Year's gift. Despite this, we managed to meet once. He came to my house, and when I approached his car to give him the gift and wish him a Happy New Year, I wanted to leave, but he noticed something was off. He then insisted that I get in the car. Once inside, he asked what was wrong, and although I initially insisted I was fine, I eventually broke down in tears. I ended up sharing my feelings with him, and he responded with a rather ambiguous reaction, saying he was unsure how to respond and that he did not mean to replace me. It seemed that the conflict was resolved, and we went for one last walk on January 1. After that, he began spending time with Lily. On January 7, I began a relationship with my boyfriend. I was still sorting out my feelings, and Mike's friend helped clarify things, advising me that if I had no feelings for Mike, I should simply say no. However, I didn't want to say no. That day, Mike and I ended up talking and decided to start dating. In the evening, I sent him a voice message announcing that we had started dating. Immediately afterward, I was blocked by him. He had previously blocked me a couple of times when I said things he didn't like. Of course, I felt disheartened but assumed that I would be unblocked by morning. That did not happen. He blocked me on every platform except TikTok. A day later, I reached out to him there, asking what was going on. He responded with a message explaining that he had anticipated this reaction, and I requested that he unblock me on at least one other platform to facilitate our conversation. I will not recount the entire exchange, but he mentioned that he had previously stated that if I started a relationship with someone, he would cease contact with me. I have no recollection of such a statement, and throughout those 4 years, I had not dated anyone. Consequently, I urged him to engage in a more reasonable dialogue since I was receiving only brief responses to my lengthy messages. Ultimately, I gathered from our exchange that Tim had repeatedly criticized Mike's character, having spoken negatively about him for the past 6 months. Yet, despite this, I was the one whom he deemed foolish for dating him. Tim exclaimed, "You've wasted 6 months just for me to say now, let me make a mistake." I replied, even if it turned out to be a mistake, allowing me to make it was my choice, especially since the treatment I received now was significantly better. I was not being mistreated or insulted. Mike was attentive, giving me gifts, flowers, and generally treating me well, even if nothing serious had developed. It was an experience that would serve as a lesson for my future. After that, I only saw Tim once when my best friend, Mike, and I were driving in the car. We stopped in a parking lot where everyone usually gathered in the evenings, including Tim. We drifted and sat in our cars. He was there with Lily, seated in their vehicle, and when we approached, they paid us no attention, so we left after a short while. Since then, we have only communicated 4 times. He asked if I needed a ride to the train station, but I informed him that Mike would take me. Now, the only remnant of our communication is a spark on TikTok. I am uncertain why this connection remains, but I would feel very sad to lose it. I continue to cherish that spark, and I think about this situation almost daily. I cannot shake my feelings. I miss Tim deeply. Story 2. Mom blames herself for a kitchen fire, but I know it was my fault. Years later, the guilt still haunts me. Should I finally confess what really happened? This story takes place when I was in middle school. I believe I was about 12 or 13 years old. My mother and I had moved to a new house, and it was my 2nd week living there. That morning, I was heading to my new school. I had to change schools in the middle of the academic year because of the move and also due to issues with bullying at my old school. On that morning, I felt both nervous and excited. I was in a rush to get to school because I did not want to be late on my first day, so I was up and ready, just waiting for my mother to finish getting ready for work. I remember bumping into the stove knobs and my backpack, roughly brushing against it as I walked by to get my shoes. I did not think anything of it and proceeded to put my shoes on. After putting my shoes on, I glanced back at the stove and saw that it was turned on. Being young at the time, I had been told not to interfere with the oven or stove, and I did not know how to turn it off or operate it. I feared I would get in trouble for turning it on, so I said nothing and simply waited for my mother to come out, thinking she would notice it was on and quickly turn it off before we left. I remember there being items placed on the stove, such as paper towels, a tray, and some other things, but it was a long time ago, so I do not recall everything. I just know there were things around the stove. I was young and foolish at that time and did not consider the risks, thinking, "Oh, my mother will notice." It turned out she did not notice, and we both left the house without turning off the stove. As we were driving down the freeway, my mother started receiving alerts on her phone. We had an alarm system that notifies our phones when a fire is detected or when doors or windows have been opened. My mother looked at her phone and said, "That is strange. For some reason, it is indicating that the smoke alarm is going off." I immediately panicked as the realization hit me. I yelled, "The dog is in the house. We have to go back right now." My mother replied, "I do not think there is an actual fire. I believe the new alarm system is just glitching or something." I remember crying and pleading with her to turn around. She was hesitant because she did not believe there was a real fire, considering we had only left the house about 10 to 20 minutes earlier, and she could not understand how a fire would have started. Eventually, my mother relented and turned around, mainly worried about being late for work if it turned out to be a false alarm. I recall crying throughout the car ride back because I secretly knew that the fire was real and that it was my fault. I did not tell my mother that, and kept my silence about what had occurred. We returned home to find 2 fire trucks because our alarm system alerts the fire department after a certain amount of time. I never knew how, but they were already in our house. I assumed they had entered through a window. My mother and I were pleading with them to allow us in to retrieve our dog, and they seemed confused, saying, "There was a dog in there." I immediately collapsed to the ground, crying and pleading with them to let us in. They informed us that they could not allow us in at the moment because our kitchen was on fire, but they would go and retrieve the dog. After what felt like an eternity, they told us that there was no dog in the house and that they believed she might have escaped through the front door. I began sobbing even harder, knowing it was my fault. I realized that I caused this, and now our dog was gone forever because of me. Once they extinguished the fire, they started assisting us in searching for our dog, but they could not find her. After an hour, they left, but my mother and I continued looking for her. My mother was trying to put on a brave face and act as though everything was fine, but I could see in her eyes and hear in her voice that she wanted to cry. Fortunately, our house was fine. The fire was only in the kitchen and did not spread throughout the entire home. To this day, my mother blames herself for the fire, believing she left the stove on. I have never had the courage to tell her that it was me who started the fire. I do not know how she would react. I do not understand why, but I have this lingering anxiety that if I were to confess my mistake, even all these years later, she would hate me. She is not that kind of person, and she is a really good mother, but it is just one of those irrational fears I hold. This situation deeply traumatized me, and I have been afraid to admit what I did. I live with the guilt every day.